Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 142nd edition of the Frank and Stan chat. And for those of you watching on video, you'll notice that Stan's not with us this week. So we have Stan's stand-in is probably. We always revert back to Susan. So hello, Susan Breckell, how are you?
Hello, I'm fine. It's lovely to be here again, replacing Stan. It's nice to see you. Nice for a chat on a Friday morning with bright sun again in
I
GW.
know. I think we've had you on as a guest 2 or 3 times, haven't you? How many times have you covered for Stan's absence?
So this is my second time being Stan and twice being a guest. So
Right. Which
fourth
is
of
not
fourth time.
not bad out of 142 editions, is it?
Yeah.
So, Dan's in North Wales, and he will be talking about an issue I think later. And he's spoken to me this morning about it, and he sends his regards to both of you. So anyway, so Anne Morris, you're back with us for your second visit. So welcome back.
Thank you very much, Frank. Delighted to be back, and it's obviously a shame Stan's not here, but absolutely lovely to meet Susan.
Now, you've been a guest here before, and I've known you, Anne, for, I don't know, it must be getting on for 10 years, I think. But can you just explain how we know each other and the sorts of work that you're involved in?
Yes, so we were introduced probably about 10 years ago, something like that, Frank, by a mutual colleague who was coming out of Teach First, and obviously you had strong connections with Teach First. And that colleague was working with us at the time, so in our business. So I run an organisation called Yipiyap. We provide in school and in college and online now tutoring to schools and colleges. So we don't do any real private support with parents. It's not that sort of setup. We work directly with schools and colleges and have done for 10 years, so way before COVID and the National Tutoring Programme. And we recruit and employ young people to deliver that support. So that's really our sort of USP, if you like. We work with school leavers, recent graduates, typically people who can present as a peer mentor to schools and colleges, and therefore you have a different kind of relationship with those students than anybody else in school, really. Quite a lot of work we do is with schools that don't have sixth forms, where you just don't have that peer mentor type character, if you like, in school. And this is something that I felt for a long time. And just to give a little bit of a flavour, my background is I was a maths teacher for a number of years, and then went into accountancy, became a mum, did various other things in my previous life, and then started Yipiyap, when I was coming back into the world of work. And I just could see the benefits of tutoring. So I think when you've been a maths teacher, you never get away from people asking you, this person's daughter, this person's son, can you help out? So I'd always had a toe in the water. I've never set myself up as a private tutor or anything like that, really, but, family, friends, that sort of thing, I would help. But I knew the benefits. You could see the benefits. It's so obvious when you're working one-to-one or with, a very small group, you can see how you can make progress so quickly. But then you bring into this other element of peer mentoring as well, and it's just fantastic. You kind of get that real magic connection with students who really don't like a subject, but they really like that person they're working with, and they present very differently, as I say, they're very relatable, very cool. That's a very uncool word to use for young people, but they can have that real connection, and so that's where we started. 2 tutors back in 2012, and now we have a team cohort of about 133 tutors. Wow. They tend to work with us more or less full-time. They're all 4-5 days a week typically. They're typically on a gap year, either between school and university or after university, or now sometimes on a sandwich year in university. So we do have a number of those candidates. And really it's just something which has taken a long time to kind of get going, because it was a really new thing when we started, but it is something which now has always captured the imagination, or feels like it captures the imagination of people in school, and leaders who want to come with a different approach. There's so many leaders who have vision of a slightly different approach, and this is something that provides that.
Right. It's funny because I think I mentioned to you, was it earlier in the week or last week, that I decided that I was going to write a short paper about how I'd how Northern Powers Partnership had tried to involve, get the tutoring program running at the beginning of the first lockdown. And actually, only when you described it there, I think I've copied your approach and used it as my own.
You
So
recognise
yeah,
it is.
I'm really sorry. But actually what happened was Henry Morrison phoned me up, I think it was the first day of a lockdown, the first lockdown, and said, Henry's the CEO of the Northern Powers Partnership. And he said, and he was quite clear, he said, this is going to hurt the most disadvantaged communities the most. So, you know, what are we going to do about it? I remember saying, what are we going to do about it? And the first thing I said to him was, well, there were two things. The first is that the most disadvantaged are probably not going to be very well connected, so they're going to have a problem getting online. And the second thing is what's going to happen when the kids go back. You know, I had this vision of them all being sort of rowdy. You know, I had visions of year 10s swarming around the place and everybody, but I felt as though there needed to be something which was more personal. And so, you know, I had this idea of using undergraduates or graduates, recent graduates, and we got Sheffield Hallam on board, and they created a Grow mentoring program. But actually, I think, Anne, all I've done is copied your approach. So apologies for that.
It's an excellent approach, so I'll be very
One of the things, though, I mean, Anne, I have to say, we connected when you were on before. I think there was some level of disappointment, wasn't there? I think, and I explained this in the paper, about the fact that the tutoring program became quite a centralized program, and one that actually had within it an expectation about how best to do tutoring, and actually that made it difficult for you, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a subject that I find, you know, I'm happy to talk about it always, but you know, it was very difficult at the time. So just to give a little bit of a summary of what happened. So June 2020, the National Tutoring Programme was announced that this was going to happen. Obviously, children starting to go back into school that September. And, you know, we had been in existence for 8 years at that point. You know, it was absolutely, this is exactly what we do in school tutoring. I wrote an open letter to the government saying, if you want help, come to me, because there's not many people do this. So if you want any advice and help and support setting it up, I'm your woman. You know, come and be really open with what we do, how it works and so on, and, you know, see if we can help. And I had this real sort of vision of being able to help. It went to the EEF. And, you know, fair play to them, I think, in hindsight. I was very cross at the time, but in hindsight, I think, you know, they had a difficult job thrown into trying to work out how to do something they didn't really know how to do. And they must have had loads of voices, not much, you know, expertise in that sense. I think they accepted that when they sort of, you know, didn't go again for the programme the next year. And really, you know, it was something that, you know, we were very disappointed because we didn't get accepted onto the list first time, and in fact, you know, it's very disappointing because only 33 providers did out of the whole country. So how, you know, were those 33 tuition providers going to serve the whole country? It was a nonsense, and really, and so that in the first year that scheme, I felt really floundered, but not from a lack of intent. It's just people not knowing what they were doing.
Just before you get onto that, how did that affect Yipiyap? Because actually, did that draw schools away from you towards them, or did you actually manage to maintain that relationship that you had? Were schools ignoring the EEF 30 odd and coming to you, or was it actually quite hard to keep them on board?
So it was a bit of a mixed bag, because again, schools were all flailing around this new initiative, not quite knowing where to do and how to deal with it. And, you know, we just thought we'd keep just a steady ship, you know, let's just take a breath, see what happens. Will our loyal schools, if you like, people who work with us for years, will they stay with us? Will they move away? You know, what will happen? So we basically went into it with a very open mind, and we found really that in terms of our reach, we pretty much doubled during the period, you know, in that first year, in terms of the number of hours and number of tutors that we had on board and the amount of tuition we're delivering. We did have some, obviously in that first instance, they're looking at, I can't remember what the figure was now, but I think it was 60% or 40% or something of the invoice was paid for by the government, by a grant, if you went with a tuition provider. But there were massive difficulties with this. There just wasn't enough tuition out there. There just wasn't. How can 33 serve the whole country? They just couldn't. So some people did. They tried, and they got with a tuition company that they went with that was on the list. When I touched base with them later, talking about the next year, very many of them had been disappointed with the provision, and they, you know, were looking not to continue with that for whatever reason. You know, some were happy. That's great. You know, there are other good tuition providers out there. The tuition providers are available. But you know, as I say, we kept our sort of core heart and soul exactly where we were. We did not deviate 1 inch from what we deliver and what we try to do. We didn't badmouth people, we didn't rail against the scheme particularly, you know, we just stayed as we were and provided good tuition, and more people, the real benefit during that period was people were talking about and recognised the need for exactly what you're talking about, Frank, that personal connection that people were really searching for. So even though they couldn't get it elsewhere, they were aware of it, and they were aware that, you know, there may be options out there. So what always happens with us is that we don't really advertise big, we go by word of mouth, and so schools tell other schools, and now schools are asking, what are you doing, what are you doing? And this is starting to now build into something. So for the first, well, certainly the first 2.5 years, it was literally, of the business, it was literally me knocking on doors, knockback after knockback after knockback. By about year 6, we've got a kind of, you know, fledgling kind of group of schools that we've worked with and so on. It was a slow build. Fast forward to 2020, boom, you know, the whole world is starting to look at this, and we are really well placed. We have such good systems, such a good setup, know exactly what we're doing, so we can go into places and tell them how it works. Not ask, you know, not ask how.
Your system's quite good though. It's quite good though, isn't it? Because it is flexible around what the needs of the school are as well. It isn't. I think that was one of the problems, wasn't it? I think of the tutoring program initially. There was a view that this is what you're getting, you know, where actually I think going back to the work that I've done with Sheffield Hallam, there was very much co-production of this. It's very much done with the schools about what is it you need, you know, what's the best way to provide that, you know, where's the best area to focus in on. And I think that for me, Yipiyap's trying to meet the needs of the school rather than a perceived idea as, I mean, you know, probably what's going to work best, but you still have that discussion with the schools.
So the key thing about what we do, I agree. So the key thing about what we do in that respect is we don't run a program. We provide tutors into schools and let them, let's say they're young people, they're not going to come in and take over or anything like that. They come in and they will do the job that they need to do, which is engage and work with, you know, small groups on that basis. So we don't come in with this sort of program idea. And the problem was, I guess, from the point of view of the quality that was being delivered, you know, it's obviously, as I say, good tuition providers out there, but there was a reason that I wrote that open letter. It's because I had 8 years of experience of working with schools in this way, and it's not easy. You know, there was 8 years of learnings there. It's not as easy as pop people in and just expect it to work. There's all sorts of context around it, and so that was why, you know, I was really sort of disappointed not to have been involved on that first run through. As I say, we're very, very tailored in what we do, and it's, you know, we don't have a wholesalers we can go to and get tutors from. We recruit people who, you know, we see their skills and what they can bring to it, and everybody's unique. And schools who've worked with us for 9-10 years, different tutor every year, they still get that same quality, because what you're buying into is the quality of what we deliver in terms of training and ethos and the year that they have with us. You know, they tend to work with us for a full year on a gap year. You know, it's that people really, really buy into, and then they have a great person who actually arrives with them. You know, it's that sort of thing.
So has it tipped now? Do you think tutoring's to stay? That this is part of the landscape for schools now?
Well, we're obviously very conscious of this because the funding lasts next year, 25% this year, so it is being tapered down. But I think, you know, in terms of an evidence-based provision, evidence-based in you know, initiative to sort of support students, you really can't do much better. I mean, it is such a fantastic initiative. You know, it's a really good way of meeting the needs that schools want. So I'd be really surprised, having put such great efforts into building up what is that provision and building up companies to deliver this and so on, because obviously 3 years down the line there are more people who are geared up to doing it and understand and, you know, be able to work through and have, you know, good relationships with schools who like working with them. I'd be really surprised if the mood music went to, right, okay, you know, scratch the record, we're off and, you know, doing something else now. That seems very odd, but you never know. Yes, I don't know. Just a very quick word about, if I can, just about Randstad. I don't like to talk about Randstad very much, but that year, just to sum up in a sentence, was a complete disaster. I think from every point of view, that's why Randstad were, you know, let go, if you like, in the May to 2020.
But what was interesting, wasn't it, about their tender was significantly cheaper. You know, it stood out as a bit of an outlier. Somebody should have been asking, well, how are you doing that? You have no presence at all in this field. You know, how are you going to sort of undercut existing businesses who are doing this and have been doing it for a long period of time? It seemed a weird. I mean, I don't really want to get involved in, that procurement
Yes.
process, because you then, oh well, I wonder who was doing. Well, anyway, let's not go down that road. But it was a disaster, wasn't it?
It was a disaster, but the slight sort of turning point for us within that is when Randstad first took over, they did an open bid sort of thing. You could bid as a provider. We weren't successful on that first bid with Randstad either, which was again very annoying, but kind of we weren't that bothered at this point because we had lots of interest going on anyway. Then it got to the November and they did another open bid because they just weren't getting people in, and their remit is to get lots of tuition companies in, and actually tuition companies are going, well, we don't need this anymore, we're getting schools come to us direct. So we went for it again because in theory there's a bit of a pride at stake here. We'd like to be on the scheme if we can, that would be great. So we got it in November, we got approved as providers, but actually by that time we'd heard so much about how difficult it was day to day that we thought we're just not going to go there. We owe it too much to the schools that we're working with to start sort of chasing things that aren't even there yet. So we'll not go forward with it. So we got approved, but we weren't actually contracted. So then fast forward to Randstad, obviously not then in charge, and Tribal coming in. We'd set up all our support for the year ahead coming, and it was just so funny because they Tribal took over and they were working with tuition providers like ourselves, quite a few, I think, probably 10 maybe more providers who had brilliant relationships with schools, but now the rules have changed. So over the summer the rules have changed, so you can only get the funding if you are a tuition provider. And so what they then are in this situation with all these tuition providers who aren't actually official tuition providers, and how do you get them on that quickly in time for September the 5th? They only took over on September the 1st. So luckily we found out and had conversations with them beforehand and were able to sort of fast track through our process. And because our process had already been approved by Randstad, but that doesn't transfer over automatically, so it was a bit of a mess. But Tribal were brilliant, and I have to say, hats off to them. They've come in, and as far as I can see, and we've not just been through that part of the process, we've had a review with them. The dialogue is what the difference is. It's just the other two providers just were, no, you're not on. Okay, any reason for that? Any sort of understanding? But Tribal have been much more, right, let's make sure you are sort of fit
for purpose.
And then if you have any sort of ongoing, we will have dialogue around that, and it's just so much better two-way.
Fabulous. Well, that's a positive way of ending what was quite a tortuous journey, but I'm pleased to see that Yipiyap are thriving once again. So Anne, Susan, let's move on to what's caught your eye this week. You've been quite busy this week, haven't you?
I have, yeah. I've been at a conference this week for heads and chairs for one of the schools, which is a large multi-academy trust. So it's a really interesting conference, brings together, lots of people to hear about how the trust's moving over the next year and where it's been. But I was already thinking about this to talk about when other incidents have, come into the news this week about head teacher well-being, because I think a lot of the benefit of being at this conference is the conversations that go on outside the main sessions, which I spoke to a lot of head teachers, very experienced head teachers, very new head teachers, and lots of chairs of governors as well. Again, very new, very experienced. And I spoke to one retired executive head, very, very experienced, the sort of person anyone would go to for advice. And we were talking about, accountability and, talking to people. And he said, who's asking the head teachers if they're okay? And my retort as a chair of governors is always, well, that should be the chair of governors, but that doesn't necessarily always happen or always work. This went on. We had, a big long chat about this with other chairs of governors about how it worked or how it didn't work. This was all in my head when the tragic news that came out last night of Ruth Perry, who a head teacher that has, very sadly committed suicide. We think that her family is saying after an Ofsted report. Obviously, I'm sure we all pass our condolences on to the family, friends, school, everybody connected with her. But you know, it really brought home to me about, you know, the impact that not just Ofsted, you know, other accountability measures can have on our head teachers, and what we're doing. You know, I'm always of the mind that it can be a really, really lonely place being a head. Not all heads have people to talk to. I do sometimes think that the trust system is slightly better for that, because there is a bit of a collegiality. There are other heads to talk to within your trust. My concern looking now at the LA system is sometimes that there might not be, if you're in competition with the school next door, there might not be that, you know, you might not want to go to that head teacher because of that. Obviously, you did a Frankenstein chat with the headrest people about their report, and you know, that was really fantastic. But you know, this is an issue, and it's going to carry on while we have this Ofsted system, I have to say, where, you know, one day, one snapshot, one visit can have such an impact on somebody's career. And you know, I know recently lots of heads have been very affected by reports. I think somebody said on Twitter today they're the only educator's name on the report. That's really, you know, that's really tough, isn't it, to do that? Yeah. So
I mean, I would say Stan contacted me before the recording, just to, if we were going to talk about this, to offer his condolences as well. But actually, I think it's, as you said, Susan, it's not just Ofsted, is it? Because there are other. It's quite interesting actually during COVID, when schools were not, when children were not sitting exams, there was no league tables, there was no Ofsteds. There was the areas that I support in the work that I do, phenomenal level of support for each other.
absolutely,
There was a real sense of camaraderie and people coming together. And actually the fundamentally important thing was that all the families had sufficient food, the children were cared for, and actually if that meant the school couldn't do it, somebody else down the road, another school, would help out. But I think we need to get to a position like that where there's a more collegiate feel to it. I think the competition element of it has got too big a grasp of the process. And it was funny because I saw Adrian Lyons, who's been a guest here. He was another former HMI, and he reminded me that there was a framework which said that you can't be in the term outstanding school, you know, unless you've got clear evidence of supporting weaker schools in your community. And you know, it could go as far as to say, you know, that a key element here is when a school does get inspected, and I hope they're not done in the way they're done now, but actually a key component is, well, what do the other schools think of you? You know, because if actually all you're doing is dissing everybody else and taking all of their more well, sort of higher attaining, slightly more ambitious, whatever kids are, you're drawing them in at the detriment of other schools, then to me that's not really improving that school. That's just cherry picking, isn't it, really? So I think there's something here about trying to get a feel for how does the landscape look within the community, and what role are different schools playing, even if they belong to different trusts.
We did a session at the conference, and it was only for chairs of governors, and it was about, are you a good neighbour? And that was really, you know, to your community. But I think that reaches out to that, you know, are you a good neighbour? Or you know, we all know conversations that schools will sometimes have that will say, oh, your child's got special needs. Well, X school is an expert on that. We're probably not the right provider for you, and so on you go to X school, which you know, maybe it's them being neighbourly, but maybe it is for an ulterior motive, and it is that. I remember a conversation, or you've just prompted me with it, Frank, a good maybe 15 years ago, with a director of education who was speaking about an outstanding school in the area where we live. And I said, oh, you know, how have they got there? And he said to me, yeah, they've got there, but what have they done for anyone else to get there? And I thought that was really, you know, that was interesting at the time, because that put that seed in my head, actually, that, you know, in governors' meetings or anything, are we sitting thinking, what is the impact of our decision on our neighbours? And, you know, that is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree.
I can just chip in. So I think it'd be a brilliant sort of setup where everybody helps their neighbours. I mean, that is the absolute ideal, isn't it? And within a community, that you're all sort of working together for the benefits of that community and each other within that community, which I think is amazing. Just when I've only been talking there, Susan, I was just reflecting on my husband and I are members of an organisation called YPO, Young Presidents Organisation, and within that organisation, it's basically an organisation for CEOs, a sort of club, because CEOs find themselves in a very similar sort of position. You know, often they can't talk to their colleagues about certain things because those colleagues are involved in those things, or whatever it is, they're confidential or whatever. And so having a connection with other CEOs in non-competing businesses is very, very useful indeed in this sort of confidential environment. And I just wonder whether something, I mean, I tend to go into fixer mode, I don't really want to do that, but, you know, I wonder whether there is some scope for that, where you just connect people, because as soon as you connect people on a human level, you all have things to share, you all have things to kind of unburden, and that real opportunity where it's confidential, you know, it's not going to go any further, that you can then share that with other colleagues who perhaps you never see, or otherwise they're not part of your community. Obviously, if they are, then you know, brilliant, but there's an extra dynamic there. But here, you know, you'd have people who are not necessarily connected and just able to empathise, share, unburden, as I say, and having that outlet is, I think, incredibly useful.
I agree. I mean, those I'm looking at the moment to try and secure residential for secondary head teachers in Blackpool, and they haven't had one for, well, they didn't have one obviously during COVID, but they didn't have a tradition of having one before COVID. But there's something a bit like the point you're making, Susan, that at times, you know, you can say, well, it's a bit of a swanny, isn't it, really? You know, an overnight somewhere, I'm sure you'll be in the bar, you know, but in a way, some of those, you know, I'm not suggesting anyone gets drunk or anything like that, but some of those informal discussions that you have, you know, are the sorts of things that begin opening up telephone number sharing, which mean that somebody, you know, I felt as I connected with you, can I just have a word? You know, it's these sorts of things that I think we've perhaps ignored. And it may be the mental health element here, that we haven't supported it well enough post-COVID. But I feel that now. I feel as though people are ready to be much more brutally honest about stuff. And the head teacher's example, the sad story there is, you know, brings it all to a head, really, in terms of, you know, if you've got a problem, you really do need to share it with somebody you can trust.
That's it. Having that space to do that, I think, is very important. Yeah.
And what's caught your eye this week?
So what caught my eye was the release of some government data which showed that nearly 2 out of 5 disadvantaged children were now, well, from a report last year, so 21-22, persistently absent still in school. And this very much mirrors what we see in tutoring day to day, week to week. You know, conversations with heads or senior leaders is about how difficult it is to, you know, get students to come back and attend, you know, even now, the various reasons, illness ongoing, this whole thing about Fridays and working from home parents, you know, it's easier for children to stay off. So Susan, I'm going to hand over to you because I know you've got direct experience of this.
Yeah, well, you know, in my schools, it is a huge issue, and I know that we've had people come into both schools to look at what we're doing, and we're probably doing everything that you can. In my primary, we're looking at you know, offering free breakfast club to children who who aren't attending, to try and encourage them in. This, and unfortunately, it hasn't been taken up by lots of families. When we dig a bit further down to see why, it can sometimes be that breakfast club starts too early for the family, and so that's an even bigger barrier. We've also where we have seen some successes has been actually a child that was old enough to walk on their own to school, and so now was getting themselves up and out without any parental involvement, and we're really, really pleased with that. But we can't, we can't be asking the 4-year-olds to come in on their own. But it's really good, and I believe that this student, when attendance was celebrated with her class, has said, "Oh, it wasn't me this week that meant we didn't win the prize." Hopefully, you would like to think that an engaging curriculum and things would mean that children wanted to be in, but in a lot of cases we're penalising children because of parental behaviours.
Yeah, that's this sort of issue around attendance awards, particularly. I mean, we've got 2 grandchildren at primary school living with us at the moment. One whose attendance is virtually 100%, and the other one who has, as Anne was saying before, had been ill. Her attendance was something like 91% or something, but it wasn't the fact that she didn't want to go to school. It was just that she was not well, and I'd be very, very sad if there were awards being given either to classes for good attendance or for individuals for good attendance, when in fact it would be that child who perhaps brought the class attendance down through no fault of her own, or also was penalised for the fact she'd been ill, genuinely ill. I just don't think there's enough thought given to the circumstances around some of this stuff.
I think it may have worked well in previous times, but unfortunately when you've got COVID, it's caused a massive effect with attendance, but then the ongoing lack of immunity to diseases, bugs and things that are going around, it's something which is very much ongoing. I think we've all seen the lurgy going around, over the last few months, and that really hitting people low. I mean, from my own business, I never take a day off work, but I had a day off. So it was really serious.
I think one of the things, I want to move on because we're going to run out of time, but the one point I want to say is that the narrative around this is as if the schools are to blame. I feel as though we've got to be very, very careful here about where the responsibility for this lies. It rests in a number of areas, and it would be wrong for the schools again to take full responsibility for all this, which I sadly think is where some of the politicians are pushing this, because it's easier to do that rather than consider, well, did we actually invest enough in the sorts of support mechanisms we're going to need post-COVID? I think the Kevin Collins 15 billion seemed to disappear, and all we've got is a little bit of the tutoring left, isn't it, really?
And I think that in the schools, I genuinely can hold my hand up and say that my schools are doing absolutely everything that they could do. However, there are no services around them that would have also, they are being social services, they are being the EWO, they're being
the mental health service.
That's it. That all of that is on the school now, and they can't be all of it.
Well, what's caught my eye, I'll make this fairly brief, is the Fylde Coast Skit Ofsted report has now been published, and there's an article in Schools Week this week where this was used as one of 2 examples of a skit that has performed really, really well under the Ofsted framework and has not been reaccredited. So that means to say, under these IT proposals, it will no longer be providing teachers for the Fylde Coast and Blackpool. And so senior leaders in Blackpool are aware of 2 things. First, that the Skit provides really good teachers. And secondly, we don't know who's going to fill the gap. So we can see this sort of like recruitment crisis happening nationally, but biting most particularly in an area which is at times quite difficult to attract teachers to. And so really just a shout out to Ali Spencer, who is basically running the Skit and is amazing. And actually a real, sort of, we've dealt with this a number of times on this chat, but we could see this problem occurring, and actually there's been insufficient support post that decision to ensure that everybody knows, because I can't tell you where those teachers are going to come from. And so we are now starting to worry, I wouldn't say panic, but worry about what will happen. And we're trying to do work with schools to sort of help them recruit more teachers from further afield, to be honest, to come and relocate in the Northwest. But in a way, that's not really sorting the problem. It's just taking the neighborliness of it isn't very good, is it? Because we're taking them away from somewhere else. But actually, we have no other way of doing it, because we don't have now that local provider in that way. Anyway, Anne, what are you going to bring to us today as the one thing you would provide or you'd want to see change that might improve the education system?
Okay, so I mean, a million ideas pop into my mind when that happens, but yeah, I mean, I had to narrow it down to one, but it's one which has stuck with me for a number of years now, and I became aware of it because I went again, Teach First link here, so I managed to get onto a Teach First event that was happening, which was showing a film of this in practice, and basically it's project-based learning. And I mean, this may be something which is very, very well sort of known and considered. But
it is in the primary sector, because it's how we used to teach before subject people got involved. And I'm not making a judgment on either side of this, but yeah, but it is more of a primary based approach. But go on.
So I'd seen this film about a school called High Tech High at secondary level in the US, and it just looked like this idyllic place. I mean, it was so inspirational. And the things that were different about it, so this is not any sort of comments on qualified teachers. I love teachers, but it was taking people from the community to come in and be teachers, people who wanted to come and teach in their area, in their field of expertise, sorry. And, by doing that, you really engaged people who were just passionate and had all this experience from elsewhere that they were bringing in. The assessment was all around community, so the children would go and make a project which involved a number of different skills in order to bring that together, and they worked together on it pretty much full time, or they might have been working on a couple at once, but they basically worked on these projects. And then the assessment was an open evening for the community to come in and kind of pass judgment on it, and then they had to present about what they were doing and that sort of thing. I know it's very difficult. I know it's magic one time, and you can't change things like that overnight, but seeing how engaged students were in what they were doing, because they had a voice in what they were doing, and they had the ability to give it direction, and they were working with people who were not bothered about exams, and they were just enjoying the development process of the project. Oh, it was just fabulous.
Well, you've got me going now.
I'd love to see it again.
Well, I was a head of Lower Park Primary School in Poynton. And in, I think it was 2000, we won the school's curriculum award. And I remember going down to London with a couple of the pupils and Barbara Chadwick, the teacher who led on this. But basically the school's curriculum award was just that. It was about how are you using your community and all its resources to give young people a better understanding of their place. And that's the starting point for your experience. At the moment we have, I was talking to a colleague about this recently, we seem obsessed with kings and queens in history, but actually I visited a school, one of the co-op academies in Stoke, and one of the year 8s had absolutely no idea the pottery industry was central to the development of where he lives. And he'd been brought up in a primary school. Yeah. And then 2 years into the secondary school, had no idea of his place, and actually, when you think about the point you're making, there are ceramic businesses in Stoke who should be crawling all over that school, shouldn't they? And the school should be crawling all over those businesses, because that's a central part of the place in which they live. And there's still the remains, sadly, under-resourced, underused of the kilns that we used around Tunstall and Burslem in Stoke, and children walk past those possibly with very little idea about why they're there. Why aren't they being used? It's all of that. It's honestly that for me, if we could get to that, and that would be absolute nirvana.
Yeah, I
If we
came out of it
started with,
thinking, this is the future. This is if everybody sees in education saw this film, we'd all decide the same thing overnight. Come on, let's just do it.
yeah, but the problem is there are these subjects. I think we underestimate when you're not in central, in terms of a national education system, the power that subject associations have on the curriculum is very, very powerful. It's gripping.
Yeah.
And certainly at the moment, with certainly since 2010, they have got a vice on the curriculum. They worry about that approach because, well, the first thing is, where's the history going to come in? When are they going to hear about Henry VIII? These are the sorts of things that concern them, and of course, we can't answer that.
But this is a brilliant thing. I mean, they did one of the projects they were doing was about Greek history.
Oh, right.
And they had to do it via a play. So it was all about writing the dialogue of the play and the this.
Yeah.
It was depth. It wasn't breadth in quite the same way. They accepted that. It was depth rather than breadth. But the brilliant thing is, if you teach people how to do things in a deep way, they can go and do anything they want to, any direction in a deep way. And you don't need to do it all under observation. You can just go and then be interested and know how to get into things in a deeper way. So I thought it was fantastic. The other thing I would, if I had one
go on, because you're such a good guest.
There's one final thing that I would change. This would be a really quick fix. Would be to somehow change the word maths into problem solving throughout all education. The word maths has such. I mean, I'm a maths teacher. I love maths. Don't get me wrong. And maybe at the very high levels, you keep it as maths for the real sort of, But it puts so many people off something that they can do so easily. It just needs a complete rebrand. Maths needs a rebrand.
Yeah.
And I'm a maths graduate, and I always say to people, like, it's not maths for maths' sake, it's maths so that you can go out and solve problems in the world, and that is the most important. It's those skills that you learn. And I do think to get away from that, I can't do maths. Well, you can, because you do maths, you solve problems every day in your life. When you get on a bus, when you do this, when you do that, you can't not do maths. And I do have a bit of a thing. You don't have people going around saying, I can't do English.
I think, in year 4, they have got to get it right. It's a sort of multiplication assessment. It's not a check for the check.
Times table.
But a lot of children who can't do their tables quickly don't perform well in that assessment and that check. And that's when the die is beginning to be cast as to, well, I'm not a good mathematician then, am I?
Yeah, because other people can do it.
Yeah, well, they're the mathematicians. Yeah, it's very sad. Anyway, what an interesting chat. Stan, we have missed you, but perhaps not as much as you wish we had. But anyway, but thank you, Anne, for joining us again, and we'd love to have you back again. It'll probably be next year, because we're lined up with guests up until now, October. And thank you again, Susan, for stepping in. And I know there are a couple of weeks actually coming up where I'm not available, so it might be the Stan and Susan show. But anyway, those dates with you. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great week. And our thoughts are with the head teacher of the primary school, who sadly committed suicide. And it's a somber note to finish on, but I think it's one that we do need to remember frequently, that it's a hell of a difficult job being a head teacher.
Yeah.
So absolutely. See you all next week.
Thanks very much. Bye now.